Good morning. On behalf of Chairman Inhofe, he has indicated that he wants to start these on time and asked if we would begin with opening statements. He should be here shortly. The committee meets today to receive testimony on United States Africa Command and Southern Command. I welcome our witnesses and thank them for their service. General Thomas Waldhauser, Commander, U.S. Africa Command. Admiral Craig Fowler, Commander of U.S. Southern Command. General Waldhauser, this is likely your last hearing before this committee. I want to thank you for your nearly 43 years of dedicated service to this nation. It's also fitting to note that 12 years ago yesterday, February 6, 2007, President George W. Bush directed the creation of U.S. Africa Command. It was the right decision, and AFRICOM continues to play a vital role in the defense of our nation. This committee's top priority is to ensure the effective implementation of the National Defense Strategy, which identifies competition with China and Russia as the central challenge to U.S. prosperity and security. Both AFRICOM and SOUTHCOM should be viewed as key fronts in our global campaign to compete with China and Russia. In both of your areas of responsibility, China and Russia are increasingly active, using economic and military means to expand their influence and challenge U.S. interests. And while, on behalf of the Chairman, we agree with the need to prioritize our efforts against China and Russia, we cannot take pressure off of terrorist groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda. Despite operational setbacks, these groups continue to control territory in Africa and still pose a very real threat to U.S. interests and our partners. Lastly, while the challenges in your areas of responsibility are on the rise, both of your commands have long suffered from resource shortfalls. We look forward to you to explain how these shortfalls increase risk to your forces and impact your ability to execute the National Defense Strategy. I want to remind our members that Admiral Fowler and General Waldhauser will be available in SVC 217 immediately following the open hearing that we're in today to discuss any classified matters that may come up today. And with that, Ranking Member.
Thank you very much, Senator Rounds, and let me join you in thanking our witnesses for appearing today to provide an update on our security situation and the U.S. military activities in your respective areas of responsibility. Both of you are leading commands during very challenging times, and we thank you for your continued service. And please also extend our gratitude to the men and women under your command for their outstanding service and dedication. And let me join Senator Rounds, General Waldhauser, in thanking you for your distinguished service to the nation and the Marine Corps. I'm very concerned about the growing Chinese and Russian influence in both Latin America and Africa. China is leveraging its economic might and influence to gain access to ports and loaning large sums of money for infrastructure projects, many of which are not economically viable and will leave these countries beholden to Beijing. Russia is engaging in massive disinformation campaigns to undermine U.S. influence and propping up authoritarian regimes in both regions. Both of you are tasked to counter Russian and Chinese influence with limited funds, equipment, and people, as many of the Department's resources are being diverted to the Indo-PACOM and EUCOM AORs. I would like to hear how this implementation of the National Defense Strategy has affected the resources that you have to counter Russian and Chinese influence in these critical regions, as well as any additional resources you might need for this vital task. In Africa, as in South and Central America, we are working with local and international partners to advance our shared security goals. However, the complex and often interlocking challenges to stability will not be solved by military means alone. Indeed, many significant issues, including rapid population growth, demographic changes, famine, and migration, are long-term and multidimensional in nature and require whole-of-government policies that take an equally long-term view of investment and engagement in the region. In December, the administration announced a new U.S. strategy for Africa that highlighted the importance of the region to the U.S. economic interest and the growing competition with China and Russia throughout the continent. However, the administration has repeatedly submitted budgets that slash critical aid dollars and reduced engagement across the AOR. General Wallhauser, I hope you will discuss the importance of long-term engagement in Africa and the types of investment we should be prioritizing to best position ourselves for strategic competition in your AOR. Admiral Fowler, you also have a difficult problem set. Narco trafficking has flooded Central and South America with illicit funds that exacerbate rampant corruption, especially among police forces. Poor economic conditions and a lack of citizen security has led to a humanitarian crisis that forces families to flee to look for better living conditions. Authoritarian governments, propped up with Russian and Chinese support, are undermining democratic values and destabilizing the region. Despite all of these problems, I do want to note that there are some bright spots. We have several capable partners in the region, such as Colombia, Peru, and Argentina, who are willing to work with us and are now net exporters of peace and security. On a final note, Venezuela is an unfolding crisis. I am hopeful that there will be a peaceful and democratic transition in Venezuela, led by the Venezuelan people and supported by the international community. It has been terrible to watch the starvation of the Venezuelan people and the destruction of the Venezuelan economy by Maduro and his regime. Current efforts to support interim President Juan Guaido are being led by the State Department and Treasury. Congress must be consulted if there is any military planning action beyond the current planning for the evacuation of U.S. citizens and embassy personnel. I know the events on the ground are changing day by day, and it is possible to tell what event or set of events will trigger Maduro's departure. I'd like to hear any updates you might have and what you expect in the weeks to come. Again, thank you to our witnesses. And Senator Rounds, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Reed. General Wallhauser, would you care to begin with your opening statement, and your full statement will be made a part of the record.
Thank you very much, Senator Rounds. Appreciate it. Senator Rounds, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to update you on the efforts of United States Africa Command. I am honored to be here this morning with Admiral Fowler and discuss many of the similar challenges we face in both the AFRICOM and SOUTHCOM areas of responsibility. I would like to begin this morning by remembering the soldier we lost on the continent during operations in Somalia this past year. I offer my sincere condolences to the family of Staff Sergeant Alexander Conrad, United States Army. We honor his commitment, service, dedication to duty, and dedication to our country. We also honor the sacrifice of our African partners who paid the ultimate price across the continent this year as well to bring security, stability, and prosperity to Africa. Additionally, this morning, I would like to thank our families, service members, and civilian workforce, especially those who serve on the continent, oftentimes in remote locations, for their professionalism and commitment to AFRICOM's mission. 2019 marks the beginning of AFRICOM's second decade as a combatant command. As we enter this period, we have adapted our strategy for Africa based on updated national guidance, which includes the President's 2017 National Security Strategy and the 2018 Secretary of Defense National Defense Strategy. These documents have shaped the focus of the armed services, outlining broad guidance to enhance readiness for high-end combat while instructing the combatant commands, among other things, to strengthen alliances and attract new partners. The recently released U.S. Strategy Towards Africa, the Department of Defense Strategy for Africa, and the National Strategy for Counterterrorism refocused our whole-of-government approach in the era of great power competition to advance United States influence and maintain strategic access not only in Africa, but around the globe. Taken comprehensively, the overall U.S. strategic interests in Africa are very clear. Prevent the undermining of our alliances or destabilization of African nations, counter violent extremist organizations, decrease the potential for Africa to become a failed continent, protect U.S. citizens and the homeland, and advance American influence, including economic opportunities and transactions. To underscore the strategy for disrupting extremists, we remain committed to synchronizing our kinetic authorities. Persistent pressure on al-Shabaab, ISIS, and al-Qaeda-associated groups remains necessary to prevent this destabilization of African nations. U.S. strategic interests on the continent cannot be solely advanced through the use of military force alone. As such, AFRICOM utilizes the military tool in concert with diplomacy and development efforts to help negate the drivers of conflict and create opportunity. In Somalia, we work closely with the ambassador, now permanently stationed in Mogadishu, alongside with the USAID mission director, to help the Somalis assume responsibility for their own security and own prosperity. In Libya, our counterterrorism commitment supports the U.S. Chargé, who works closely with the international community to prevent civil conflict and facilitate the political reconciliation process. Additionally, our engagements, exercises, and activities throughout Africa are designed to increase U.S. influence, strengthen local security, and ensure our status as the preferred security partner. For example, in East Africa, our programs continue to modernize partner security forces, as in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda, who also export security and contribute forces to the African Union mission in Somalia. In North Africa, we have seen significant return on investment with Tunisia and Morocco, demonstrating the capacity to absorb advanced U.S. programs and to lead security-related exercises and operations. In the Western Sahel and Lake Chad region, AFRICOM provides training, advice, and assistance to the Western African nations, which make up the G5 Sahel organization, as well as those who make up the multinational joint task force working to contain violent extremism and secure the borders of the Lake Chad Basin countries. Our partner networks and influence ensures U.S. access for U.S. forces in times of crisis to protect our personnel and facilities on the continent, such as in Djibouti, a location which has strategic significance to multiple combatant commands. In conclusion, the most important use of the military tool on the African continent is where our engagements emphasize relationships and capacity building. And I am proud to lead a team of professionals who have built a strong and trusting relationships with our African partners, U.S. interagency, and the international community to foster security, stability, and prosperity in Africa. On behalf of the service members, the civilian employees, and families of United States Africa Command, thank you for your support, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you here this morning. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Senator Waldhauser. Senator Feller.
Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today with my shipmate, General Waldhauser, and thank you for the steadfast support you provide our men and women every day. I'm joined today by my wife, Martha, who is passionately committed to serving our military families and ensuring their readiness and welfare. Also with me are SOUTHCOM's Command Sergeant Major Brian Zicafus, my eyes and ears, representing the backbone of our military, our non-commissioned officers, and Master Chief Stacy Uren, our dedicated gender advisor. Sergeant Major, Master Chief, and our human rights team work together to build professionalism both within our SOUTHCOM team and with our partners. Professional forces have legitimacy within their ranks and their populations. Professional ready forces build trust. Western Hemisphere is our shared home. It's our neighborhood. We're connected to the nations in Latin America and the Caribbean by history, culture, and geography. From my headquarters in Doral, Florida, it takes me longer to travel to D.C. than it does to many of the countries in our area of responsibility. We're connected in every domain: sea, air, space, and cyber and land. Our security and prosperity are inextricably linked. When our neighbors succeed, we succeed. And when our neighbors are threatened, we are threatened. Our partnerships in this region are critical to the layered defense of our homeland and to our collective ability to meet complex global challenges. Ultimately, we want enemies to fear us, friends to partner with us, and the Western Hemisphere to shine as a beacon of peace, prosperity, and potential. To ensure the security of the homeland, SOUTHCOM works closely with interagency teammates, the Department of State, USAID, Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice. Teamwork within the Defense Department, especially with Northern Command and the U.S. Coast Guard, is also critical to mission accomplishment. Over the past 2 months, I've traveled to Colombia, Trinidad and Tobago, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to get a firsthand view of the opportunities and challenges that directly impact the security of this hemisphere. Criminal organizations, narco-traffickers, illegal immigration, violent extremists, corruption, and weak governments are principal among those challenges. The most disturbing insight, however, has been the degree to which external state actors, especially Russia, China, and Iran, are expanding their influence in the Western Hemisphere. Russia, in particular, enables actions in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba that threaten hemispheric security and prosperity. And as a leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world, Iran's activities in this hemisphere are concerning. Venezuela. The situation in Venezuela is dire. Maduro's illegitimate government starves its people by using food as a weapon, while corrupt generals are rewarded with money from illegal drug trafficking, oil profits, and businesses, all at the expense of the population and the rank-and-file military. Migration out of Venezuela is now over 300 million, creating a crisis for our friends in Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, and Peru. While Russia and Cuba and China prop up the Maduro dictatorship, the remainder of the world has united. SOUTHCOM is supporting diplomatic efforts, and we are prepared to protect U.S. personnel in diplomatic facilities if necessary. I saw firsthand the impacts of this humanitarian crisis in Venezuela when I visited the United States naval ship Comfort. The solidarity and compassion displayed by Comfort's international medical team made a lasting difference in the lives of thousands. The United States of America provided comfort as part of our enduring promise to the hemisphere, while Russia flew nuclear-capable bombers. Who would you want as your friend, and who would you trust? Building strong partnerships is the best way to counter threats and turn the challenges of our hemisphere into opportunities. In this hemisphere, our neighborhood, a little goes a long way. We need the right, focused, consistent military education and presence. We cannot achieve positive results and influence outcomes without being on the playing field. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Reed, thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. SOUTHCOM team, our civilians, military members, and our families appreciate the support Congress has provided us. We will continue to honor the trust you and our fellow citizens have placed in us. I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you very much. First of all, let me apologize for being late. I had a very small part to play in the National Prayer Breakfast, so I had to choose Jesus over you guys. But that's behind us now, so we're ready to get back to work. First of all, let me just go ahead and with the areas that you're working so hard in. I've been concerned about China for a long time because we saw it coming. In fact, in Djibouti, that was the first time, it's my information anyway, in Djibouti is the first time that China actually did devote its attention to actually starting a function in a country outside its city limits, and that happened in Djibouti. Now, they're as far south in Africa as Tanzania. They're making things happen, and I mean, everywhere you go, the same thing. They say, America tells us what we need, and then China, gives them what they need. And they have also, you know, we're all committed to the IMET program. They actually, in China, as you and I discussed in my office, for the first time, they've invited 50 of the leaders showed up in China, in Beijing, out of 52 nations, talking about how close they want to be with them, and what they're trying to do is expand the IMET program that we've been so successful in into China. So anyway, that's something that is there, and I'm sure you're feeling some of the effects of that. I'd ask both of you, because it's happening also in SOUTHCOM, what are the effects right now that you're seeing from China that weren't there in just until recently? Starting with you, General Wadden.
Thank you, Senator Inhofe. You know, it's interesting about Djibouti. It is the first overseas base that China has developed.
Yeah, the first one. Now, people are not aware of that this is the first base that they've established outside of their city limits.
That's correct. And, you know, it puts us in a very unique position because we have a Chinese base roughly several miles from the front gate of our location in Djibouti. So we have some interesting engagements with safety flight, weapons training on the ranges and so forth. So we have a requirement to work with them to work through some of those issues. But that said, overall on the continent, China has been there for quite some time, and they have worked at this relationship. What we try to do from the AFRICOM or DoD perspective is try to show that we are the best partner, the type of training we give them, the weapons perhaps that are sold by the United States of high quality, and try to make sure that our influence remains. It's a difficult task. You mentioned the issue of all the security chiefs into Beijing. You know, as an anecdote, I have no way to prove this, but in April of 2017, we in AFRICOM invited all the chiefs of defense to Stuttgart for a conference, and we had about 40 or so turn up. I believe the Chinese read our playbook, and I believe after that particular engagement, they saw it, and they wanted to make sure that they were on the same playing field as we were. But moreover, I would say that in addition to the Chinese defense, or the defense group, in September this year, China had a forum for cooperation between China and Africa, where over 50 of the heads of state of Africa went to Beijing, and where President Xi rolled out $60 billion or so of loans and grants and programs. So the Chinese work at the relationship, and that's one of the things that we try to combat in AFRICOM by just being good partners.
Yeah, it's been my experience in the continent that China never comes in unless there's something they can gain from it. And of course, they use their own labor, and they're not doing that much of a benefit. But nonetheless, they have resources. I can't figure out where it all comes from, but much more than we seem to. And the same thing, you don't hear so much in SOUTHCOM about the activity of China. Just real briefly, just what are your thoughts on that?
Senator, in SOUTHCOM, they're invested in over 56 ports. I recently returned from a trip to Central America, and my small team, the entire hotel floor right below ours, was completely booked by Chinese. They're offering schools, all expense paid, 13 days for a half-day school, no strings attached, and cash for the countries to do what they want. Again, so they're there, and they're there in force, and they have a long-term vision economically and militarily. Our best counter is education and being there. The IMET program is huge for our partners. They want to come to the United States. They want to go to our schools. Our schools remain the world's best, and it's something to emulate.
Yeah. This is my own opinion, but I think some of here agrees with this. Of all the comms that we have, AFRICOM and SOUTHCOM are the two that are the most under-resourced. And I'd like to have you be very blunt on, just very briefly, do you agree with that? And what do we need to do to correct it?
Senator Inhofe, I do agree that we're under-resourced. However, we do make the best and the most of what we have.
Yeah, I know that.
Certainly with reconnaissance assets, ISR assets, medevac assets, and also non-episodic, but where we could count on.
Of those you just named, which are the least resourced right now? ISR?
As any COCOM would say here, we would prefer more ISR for our counter-VEO fight.
Yeah, yeah. Do you agree with that, Admiral?
I would agree with that. We could also use some naval assets as well, Senator. I know our Navy needs a bigger Navy. We need some of that.
I understand that you're doing great work. Senator Reed.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Again, gentlemen, thank you for your service. Admiral Fowler, with respect to Venezuela, your views would be very much appreciated, but there's a presumption that the military at this point is the key sort of power base for Maduro, and that as long as they stay with him, he will be incentivized to stay in Venezuela. Is that accurate from your perspective, and what are we doing to try, and what are the Venezuelans, the legitimate president, what is he trying to do to pull the military away?
Senator, Venezuela has about 2,000 generals, more than all of NATO combined, and majority of them are on the payroll of Maduro via illicit drug trafficking and corrupt businesses, and that's what he's using to buy their loyalty and their protection. In addition, Cuba, as I mentioned in my opening statement, pretty much owns the security around Maduro and is deeply entrenched in the intelligence service, and we can go into more detail in closed session. And so that remains the center of gravity for Maduro. The legitimate government of President Guaido has offered amnesty and a place for the military forces, most of which we think would be loyal to the Constitution, not to a dictator, a place to go. And I think the diplomacy path is that path that we're trying to support.
Thank you. Over many, many years, I've had complaints about the human rights abuses in Central America, Honduras and Guatemala particularly. In fact, there's a report recently that provided by the Sisters of Mercy that a former member of the Honduran Congress has been imprisoned in a press conference suggesting who might have been involved in the killing of Berta Cáceres, who was a prominent environmentalist in Honduras. And this is just one example. So how are we conditioning our security assistance and our human rights training in these countries to promote the rule of law?
During my recent trip, Senator, I emphasized professionalism as key to being a legitimate force, and professionalism, a big part of that is human rights. And it's like blood running through your veins. If you're not legitimate to your people, you're not going to have a force that is going to ultimately secure the population. We had those discussions with all the leaders of those countries, the chiefs of their defense, and we have a human rights team that goes in there and performs workshops. Part of the steps that must be taken by the embassy and our country teams to certify the deliverance of those aids includes a certification that they're going to go to vetted forces and forces that have complied. So we're looking at that every day, Senator. It's very important to our efforts.
Let me turn to General Walthauser, but there's I think, an issue that both of your AORs share. It's under-resourcing, both military, but also on the civilian side, the AID, State Department, et cetera. And when you talk about capacity building, both of you are very eloquent and very focused. But I've traveled through AFRICOM, as you know. General Walthauser, you were host to me when I returned. In Somalia, one of the reasons al-Shabaab is so influential is that they're able to collect taxes, administer justice, provide basic public services, the civilian capacity. And so the question here now is that, you know, even with all the military effort we put in, if we don't have the civilian capacity component, I don't think your mission is going to succeed. So you can start, and you have the similar problems, I think, in South America also.
Senator, thank you. To just provide some context, you know, today, since the first time since 1991, we have a USAID mission director in Mogadishu with the ambassador. Now, this is a very important step because in December of 2017, USAID signed a over $300 million compact with the country of Djibouti. This is very significant. There are issues of education, agriculture, government business, and so forth. And so it's very important now that we have an ambassador in the country alongside with a senior USAID rep who can oversee and synchronize those development efforts and make sure that the return on investment of that $300 million is well spent.
But that is a good example of how it's working, but there are many more examples where we don't have the resources, we don't have ambassadors. The ambassador in Mogadishu arrived, what, a few months ago, finally, after years? So, I mean, there's this complementary civilian capacity issue that if we don't get right, you can do your job very well, and we will not succeed. So, Admiral Fowler, your points, because there are many of the same situations in South America and Latin America.
Exactly the same situation. The military needs to be the small M in support of the big diplomacy and the big economic E. And I see that where it's working. Example would be in El Salvador. We've made some significant progress in the reduction of violence. And this has been by targeting in really bad neighborhoods, some 50 locations where USAID comes in with public and private partnerships and partnership with the government. And we're there in small presence to connect those vetted police force with the military.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen.
I think we're all aware that we're going to have a closed session after this, so anything that gets into an area that's more appropriate in a closed session, you can pass that on to that one, Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Walthauser, I'm just curious, in your opening statement for the record regarding Djibouti, you note that our continued access and the ability to use on an unimpeded basis the Dorley container port is critical to our logistical efforts in and around East Africa. Given China's increased presence within the port complex, do you have any concerns that our access and usage could be at risk, short or long term?
Senator Rounds, thank you. You know, last year at this time when I testified, Djibouti had just taken that port over from the UAE. There's been some international court issues of adjudication. I won't get into that today. But the Djiboutians have run that port now for over a year. Based on data that we get from the embassy, the Djiboutians have, quite frankly, done a better job, been more efficient, and have had better throughput than when the Emiratis ran the port. I have spent time directly with President Goulet, talked with him and with the our ambassador there, and spoke with him about our concern that we need unimpeded access, because it's no secret that roughly 98% of the logistics support for Djibouti as well as Somalia and East Africa come through that port. That port is one of 5 entities in the overall Djiboutian port. And so our access there is necessary and required. We have the word from President Goulet that we will always have access there, and they have no intention of selling out to China. Those are his words, and his actions thus far have backed that up. So I have no reason not to believe that. But the bottom line is, I still remain concerned about our access there, because if we were denied access or had limited access, it would have a significant impact on our activities in East Africa.
Thank you. I'm also curious, I want to just change subjects a little bit. You made a comment in your statement, for the record, pertaining to Algeria. You note that U.S. relations with Algeria continue to foster cooperation and further regional stability. Can you give us some examples of what AFRICOM can do to foster the U.S.-Algerian security relationship? And I just want your thoughts also with regard to the security implications of the Tindouf refugee camps for Algeria. That refugee camp has been there for 40 years, and there clearly is an issue there that I've been there once, and I plan on being there again. I'm just curious, what's your thoughts about that situation? How big of an issue is that for security for Algeria, who clearly is allowing these folks to be there, and they're providing humanitarian aid at this time, and I'm presuming that we're offering some assistance there as well.
So let me start by talking a little bit about our relationship with Algeria. And first of all, I would say that the Russians' weapon sales on the continent, that's one of their #1 customers. They sell high-end weapons to them, ships, submarines, that type of thing. So the Russians, who sell the majority of equipment on the continent, Algeria remains a big partner of theirs. That said, I've personally visited Algeria, met with senior officials there, and the AFRICOM relationship is one that is really in a crawl, walk, run stage. We have limited engagements, but we work some issues with equipment and repairs. We have visits periodically. We've participated in some of these D-Day activities and so forth. So although it's an arm's length relationship, we do all we can to continue to foster that. Now, with regards to the refugee camps, you know, on the continent, 12.3 million internally displaced people are all over the continent. This has a lot to do with conflict. It has a lot to do with famine, drought, and the like. And all these particular camps require a lot of care and the ability for our NGOs, our non-governmental organizations, to work there freely. This has been a significant issue over the last few years, because really some of the terrorist groups don't adhere to the rules of war or the laws of war with regards to NGOs. So these camps, they're perpetuated all over the continent, and the one in Algeria, though, I'm not directly familiar with.
Okay, well, I understand that it has to do with relationships between Algeria and Morocco, challenges for a group of people that have been literally out of what they consider to be their homeland for nearly 40 years now, and it seems to me that at some stage of the game, some additional attention to that would be appropriate. And I'm not sure whether it starts with you or with the State Department, but most certainly it's an item that I think should be of interest. And Admiral Fowler, I'm just curious, you mentioned that most certainly the U.S. Navy could use some additional assets. On your wish list, if you were to request additional resources, specifically, what would be the resource that would be #1 on your list of requested items or equipment?
Senator, the additional ISR, maritime patrol aircraft, helicopters, coupled with ships. So we look forward, the Navy plans to deploy a littoral combat ship later this year. That's mission fit for the kind of missions that we'd have down there, which would involve partnering with nations, training, humanitarian assistance possibly, but also the drug interdiction. So that would be #1, top of my list, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rhodes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both very much for your many years of service. General Waldhauser, we will miss you. I'm sure you won't necessarily miss coming before this committee, however. You reference in your written statement General Waldhauser, the Women, Peace, and Security Initiative. And in the 2019 defense budget, we included $4 million in funding for full-time gender advisors. I was pleased, Admiral Fowler, that you introduced your gender advisor, who is here this morning. But AFRICOM has been commended as a leader in implementing the Women, Peace, and Security Initiative. Can you talk about what you have seen and the success of this initiative and how you've seen it be helpful in Africa?
I think, thank you, Senator Shaheen. I think the strategy we've applied over the last few years is just take little things and keep moving forward. So, for example, out of the AFRICOM headquarters, we run a program every year where we bring about 15 to 20 females from the African continent and take them all over the United States to talk to various military leaders and so forth, to give them basically a leadership seminar. We also have seen growth. For example, we run communication seminars in Cabo Verde, which is an island off the Western Africa. The number of females who have come to those particular engagements has increased significantly over the last few years. You also have an example of, we have a flintlock operation, which is a special operations main exercise of the year, which, by the way, will start here later this month in Burkina Faso. Last year, when it was in Niger, USAID was able to bring together women leaders, business leaders, bring them to this exercise, and have a discussion in a forum with military members about women in peace and what women can contribute. The bottom line is we've kept chipping away at small programs. We think they're having an impact, and we're pretty proud about what we do.
Well, I agree. I think you're to be commended. Can you talk about what kind of impact you see? Why does this make a difference?
Well, I think first of all, it's just exposure. I mean, to see that you know, a mixed gender military is a better military, and with various, you know, we have a large continent with different countries and different cultures and so forth, and it exposes them to our leadership. It exposes the African military male leaders to what the female can bring, if you will, to the military. So I think from that perspective, it's really a bottoms-up approach.
Great. Admiral Fowler, I want to switch topics because we are still struggling with the opioid epidemic here in America, and New Hampshire has had consistently, unfortunately, one of the highest overdose death rates in the country from opioids. And much of what we're seeing in New Hampshire is heroin that has been produced in Mexico, but also in a number of Central American countries, and it comes in by boat and by air into the United States. At one point, we had before you became the head of SOUTHCOM, we had a briefing with then head of SOUTHCOM who said that we interdict a very small percentage. My recollection was about 20% of what we see that we could interdict because we are lacking in resources. Can you update us on whether you're seeing an improvement in those numbers and what you need to have in order for us to do a better job with interdicting those drugs coming into the country?
Senator, it's a national security crisis, over 70,000 deaths, as you're well aware from your home state. And while I'd say we've made progress, 2017, 2018 were record interdiction years, we've got a lot of work to do. We're not there. And we're focused on our partners. El Salvador stepped up, Guatemala, Panama, but there are other partners that need to do more. And we need some additional assets, some ships, some force, we call them force packages, from the ISR that you would need to detect to what you'd need to interdict. And so more work to be done for sure in this problem, Senator.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned El Salvador because New Hampshire's National Guard has a state partnership program with El Salvador. Can you talk about the difference that those partnership programs make in a country like El Salvador?
It's one of our main efforts. They bring a lasting, long relationship to the state. Before I went to El Salvador, I had a video conference with your general, and he shared more with me than I was able to share with him, and I sent him my trip report afterwards. It really helps us build capacity. They go in there and they work on that mill-to-mill engagement. They also work on civil affairs projects where they'll go out, build a school, dig a well, and other things that we need to help stabilize the conditions for the citizens. It's very important, Senator. Thank you for the support.
Thank you. I'm out of time, but General Waldhauser, the last time you were here, I asked you about the girls who had been kidnapped by Boko Haram and what we're doing in AFRICOM to help the Nigerians in particular address that issue. Do you have any update for us?
Ma'am, I really have no update. I would just tell you that of the 276 girls who were kidnapped in April of 2014, I think the number of 163 have been recovered. The other 100, there's 113 or thereabouts that still are unaccounted for. I could talk in more detail in the classified session, but the bottom line is there has not been much progress from what I can see in terms of getting any of those remainder back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Senator McSally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, gentlemen, for your leadership. General Waldhauser, it was about 12 years ago that I was sent to Stuttgart as part of the AFRICOM transition team to stand up your command. We had just a handful of us, no resources, no facilities, no assets. At the time, we were going to be the kinder, gentler command without a whole lot of operational focus. I was the J-33, Chief of Current Operations. We very quickly realized, Africa continues to be a potential hotspot for terrorist activity, both on the East Coast and the West Coast and other areas and ungoverned spaces. And we had to ramp up very fast to be able to take on that task. However, I've seen your testimony, you're talking about al-Shabaab and the challenges in Somalia. At the time, when we were running the time-sensitive targeting operations, we literally watched with our ISR, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of al-Shabaab trained militants out there in the middle of nowhere with no collateral damage concerns, being trained at training camps and then being released because at the time the civilian political leadership in our country didn't feel that we needed to do anything about it. Like a cancer growing and metastasizing, we continued to see their strength grow and their capabilities grow, but we just didn't do anything about it. So do you have the authorities you need to address the terrorist threat in your area of responsibility now? Unlike back when I was there, I've got bad memories about all that. And also, how does that fit within our vital national interests and the national defense strategy?
Thank you, Senator. There's a lot there, and I hope we're living up to your expectations of how AFRICOM is performing. And it's a little bit better than when you were there starting things up.
I know.
Look, let me just take the strikes on, and I'll try to be brief, but I think it's important to provide some context. In April of 2017, we were given authorities from the national security apparatus to be able to have offensive capabilities inside of Somalia. Mm-hmm. That combined with the legitimacy of a federal government there, our strikes are tied to their strategy. Our legitimacy comes from our authorities as well as a federal government that we're tied in with. We had strikes for 7 months in the year of 2017 where we had 35 strikes. Mm-hmm. Last year in 2018 we had 47 strikes for the overall 12-month period. Thus far this year, we've had, I think, 12 so far. But the point I want to make is that the strikes are tied to the transition strategy that the federal government of Somalia and the Somali National Army are trying to execute. So in other words, we're trying to support their plan. President Farmajo has indicated that his main effort for security is Mogadishu, and so his transitional strategy has that in mind. Finally, I would just say that at the end of the day, these strikes are not going to defeat al-Shabaab, but they're going to provide the opportunity for the federal government and the Somali National Army to grow and assume the security of that country. I would just say that, and that points to really my bottom line is, the strikes won't defeat. We know that they are causing problems. We know that they are deterring. It's an open question as to how much, but we know it's causing al-Shabaab problems, giving this opportunity for the government. But the bottom line is that the Somali National Army needs to grow, it needs to step up, and it needs to take responsibility for their own security, not only for our strikes, but the overall international community that's tied there. We're talking about the European Union, we're talking about the United Nations, the UK, Turkey. We all have pieces of the puzzle down there, and one of our pieces is the strike aspect. But the bottom line is the Somali National Army needs to grow, needs to step up. And we have made this point very clear, both the new ambassador and myself, on numerous occasions to President Farmajo and Prime Minister Kiri. They know this. They've got to step up. It's up to them to take advantage of the opportunity they have right now.
Great, thank you. Admiral Fowler, I just have a little bit of time left, but I want to get back onto the counter-drug and the drug flow in your AOR. And I know you're short of resources that you need. What are you seeing as far as the trends of the cartel activity over water, over land, submarines, light aircraft? And I mean, they're nimble and they're innovative. So what are the trends? Are they still going kind of over water up until then over land from Mexico up? Or like what are you seeing the trends and what else do we need to combat it?
They are very nimble and they're agile and in many cases better funded than the security forces they face. So they adapt. We're seeing them go further out to sea, as far out into the Pacific as around the Galapagos and up. We're seeing them integrate with fishing vessels in a different manner. We're seeing them with lower profile vessels, and including some submerged vessels. In the air, we're seeing them use Venezuela as a launch point to fly out of Venezuela. So cross-border traffic, if you will, using Venezuela's current state as a launch point up through the middle of the Caribbean and then into remote airfields throughout Central America. And so as they adapt, we adapt, but they adapt faster and they have more flexible resources. And so we're trying to get after it, but it's a challenge.
Thanks, I'm out of time, appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator McSally. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony today and your distinguished service over many years. Admiral Fowler, last year I asked Admiral Tidd about the situation in Venezuela, including the role of military advisors from Cuba. Certainly a lot has changed since that meeting. And I want to follow up on a question that Senator Reid asked, basically related to the military, and your response was that there are more generals in Venezuela than there are in NATO. So my question is, if Maduro is going to be really relying on this military to prop him up, but what is the extent to the everyday soldiers, the enlisted folks, the discipline in the military? Do those generals really have command over that military?
Senator, the leaders, including the Cuban guards that completely surround the illegitimate government of Maduro, seem to have a grip on the top level. What we read and at this level that we talk about more in a classified session, that the rank and file are starving just like their population. I had the opportunity to go on the Colombian-Venezuela border to one of our medical camps that was operating off the Comfort and see some of these kids that had lost 25, 30 pounds in a year. They were stick thin. They'd never had medical attention. We think that condition affects a large swath of the population, and we think that that population's ready for a new leader, Senator.
Admiral Fowler, you also mentioned some of the additional assets that you need, ISR and ships, and you mentioned the littoral combat ship coming online and how that's going to contribute to the fulfillment of your mission. Could you give us some sense of the status and timing of that and how you see that being fully developed in the months and years ahead?
Senator, we expect to have a littoral combat ship this year, and that will be a big benefit for our exercise program, for our engagement with partners, and because of the flexibility it brings for counter-narcotic interdiction. Counter-narcotic will be its first mission, and then we look forward to continuous presence moving forward. We're working with our Navy. They have readiness challenges, and they don't have enough ships. I think that's been discussed well before this committee, and we have the support we need. We look forward to the assets.
In addition to those assets, I know your predecessors have talked about the fact that the Navy and the Southern Command has white hulls. It's the U.S. Coast Guard performs brilliantly in those counter-narcotics missions as well as other missions related to your task. You know, I visited Coast Guard units in Michigan who were incredibly stressed as a result of the government shutdown, concerned about their families, particularly junior enlisted, that were living on the edge. You have men and women in the Coast Guard being deployed away from home, worrying about their families. Could you talk a little bit about the impact of the shutdown on morale and the ability to execute the mission?
Sir, Monday morning I had the opportunity to stand on the deck of the Coast Guard cutter Ford with Admiral Schultz, the commandant of the Coast Guard. This crew of 110 of America's finest had deployed over Christmas, record number of seizures, 17 metric tons of cocaine, which is hundreds of lives saved in the U.S. They did that deployment with a large part without pay and without adequate parts because that was affected by contracting. And it was difficult for Admiral Schultz and I to address some of their questions. They had remarkable resiliency and remarkable attitude, and they are our main battery. During that period, there was 9 Coast Guard cutters deployed, counter-narcotics missions, some 1,600 Coast Guard men and women working for United States Southern Command. And it did have an impact, and we're thankful that the shutdown's over, Senator.
And why we can't have any more shutdowns for that very reason, to make sure that our men and women of the Coast Guard are getting paid like every other member of the military out there defending us. So I appreciate those comments. General Waldhauser, we have talked in this committee quite a bit about China's influence in Africa and as it continues to increase. You mentioned in your opening comments that Russia is also increasing their involvement. Would you please elaborate on that involvement to the committee and why we should be concerned about Russian involvement on the continent?
Senator, I think the issue with Russia has to do with influence. I think in recent months over the past year, they've perhaps got more involved in mineral extraction, but to a large degree, it's still a matter of influence, especially in areas where not, or especially in areas where they could say that the United States or the UK or Western partners are perhaps backing away from Africa. It's, I think, clear that their strategy along the northern part of Africa, southern part of NATO, if you will, in the Mediterranean, to have influence inside Libya, for example, the relationships across that country they want to have, across the continent, they want to have influence on the continent. I would just point to the Central African Republic right now, where the Wagner Group has about 175 trainers, where some of the individuals are in actually the president's cabinet, and they're influencing the training as well as at the same time having access to minerals in that part of the country. So we're concerned that that model might be looked at or viewed positively by other countries in terms of their ability to train and their ability to influence the government at the presidential level, as well as then getting involved in extraction of minerals.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Fowler, can you talk about Cuba's intelligence, security, military influence in Latin America and what they're doing and how we can combat it?
You can't talk about Cuba without talking about Russia, and Russia is entrenched in Cuba weapons systems and support. And then looking at across Latin America, we see Cuba inextricably just intertwined in all elements of Venezuela. In fact, the National Security Advisor called it Cubazuela yesterday. I would agree with that characterization. We see that in that Nicaragua as well, and it's not helpful to democracy, and it's an autocratic way of life that runs counter to really the principles of the hemisphere, which are very much a democratic hemisphere. So
the sanctions that we've imposed on nationals in both Cuba and Venezuela, have you seen them have any impact? Have you seen anybody change their action as a result of them?
We're watching that closely. We're watching the intelligence. There's a discussion of the impact. We're seeing impacts, but we haven't seen the desired result, which is a peaceful democratic transition to a legitimate government yet, Senator.
But the sanctions we've done against individuals in Cuba, and we've done that over a period of time. Have you seen? Has anything happened?
It doesn't seem to have affected the overall calculus of the Cuban regime, other than harden it, solidify it, and tie it more closely to Russia. But I think it's almost like deterrence. You don't know what happens when you don't have them, Senator, so it probably has an impact. We don't see it. I would recommend full court pressure works.
Okay. In the Venezuelan military, have you seen any cracking from the standpoint of what we've been doing over especially the last 2 weeks? Has anything changed?
Certainly, there's been readiness aspects of their military that we watch very closely. It's a degraded force, but it's still a force that remains loyal to Maduro, and that makes it dangerous. We're looking for signs of those cracking, and we can talk in the closed session on some more details and trends we're seeing.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, I'd like to ask you about a question. Well, first of all, thank you both for not only your being here today, but for your service and all you do for this country. General, I'd like to ask you about there was an article yesterday by Reuters concerning the cutoff of assistance to Cameroon because of concerns about human rights abuses by the Cameroon government. The program halted, included C-130 aircraft, a number of different things. And I'd like to, that report indicated there was a 2017 report by the U.S. State Department that listed a number of significant human rights violations and abuses that were observed in the Cameroon government. Could you comment on what we're doing there other than just this halt? Are we making progress on trying to get that government to stem the tide of their human rights violations?
Senator, thank you. Let me try to explain this, and I'll start by why we're in Cameroon and what we're doing there. We talked this morning about the Chibok girls from a couple years ago, but Boko Haram is the issue there. In 2015, they were the number one terrorist group on the planet. Depending on what you read, they've killed over 20,000 people, some estimates quite higher than that over this time frame. The Chibok girls issue, all kind of atrocities. They are an extremely volatile group that needs to be dealt with. So in that region, our mission there is to train the counterterrorism forces in northern Cameroon that deal with Boko Haram. We've been doing that for several years, and quite frankly, the BUR, the Brigade of Rapid Intervention, is the top shelf counterterrorism unit inside Cameroon. They have performed well, and and that training, by the way, has certainly law of war and battlefield ethics. So that's why we're there. The issue on the Anglophone piece, I won't go into detail on that. I think the article plus the video this morning did a very good job of explaining the history of how it got to the point where we are today. In October of 2017, when it came kind of to a head, the Anglophone states said we want to actually form our own state, the Ambazonia state. There have been issues there with atrocities, issues with allegations of law of war issues, and this is something that it brings all this to a head. Over the last several months or so, the State Department has put on hold several security force assistance programs. Right before the election in October, I, with the ambassador, went and paid a visit with President Biya, and we had a very direct conversation with him with regards to investigation of these atrocities, transparency of these atrocities, and appropriate battlefield behavior. Since that time, the State Department has made a decision not to allocate significant money, but at the same time, they've released some money that's been on hold to things like Scan Eagle and Cessna aircraft that assist in the Boko Haram fight in the north. We still have programs that we continue with them, all kind of small engagements as well as exercises. We did have we talked about the state partnership program with Nebraska. We put that on hold, and in conjunction with the ambassador, AFRICOM, we decided not to pursue that because it wouldn't have been a good place for that particular group to be, so we put a halt to that. So the bottom line is right now in Cameroon, they have been a good partner with us counterterrorism-wise, but you can't neglect the fact that they have there are alleged atrocities and what's going on there. And so we continue to take our cues from the State Department and from the ambassador, and our level of engagement will continue, but not get out ahead of what the State Department would say is if we have to take other actions. We were very emphatic with President Biya that the behavior of his troops, the lack of transparency, could have a significant impact on our ability to work with them.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. Admiral, I was struck by a couple of things with your testimony. Number one, I was struck by the charts that you provided, and because I think people are not paying as much attention. We've always heard of, since the Cold War, about the influence of Russia, but the Chinese influence in our backyard is just incredible to me. And I was struck by your initial comments about our shared responsibilities, our shared security with our neighbors, and how we share so many things together. And I'm new to this committee, and so I've been reading a lot, and I've seen that there are initiatives for the Pacific and Europe. Would some similar initiative to that be appropriate for Central America or for SOUTHCOM?
Senator, I think a big idea, an initiative that recognizes the importance of our neighborhood, recognizes that what goes on right here in an area that's connected by sea, land, airspace, cyber is important to our shared security and our future would be of great benefit. I worry, Senator, that we're not going to be present on the field and enough numbers to play the game. We've got to be there to influence the outcome and the results.
All right. Well, thank you, sir. And we'll send you some more Mobile-built LCSs.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your appearance today and your service to our nation, for all those men and women who serve underneath you in Africa Command and Southern Command. Admiral Fowler, I want to return to your comments about the presence of Cuba and Russia in Venezuela. You said earlier, Cuban guards completely surround the Maduro government. Does that mean that Maduro is dependent on the Cuban security and intelligence forces for his continuation in office?
Senator, I think it's a good sense of where the loyalty of the Venezuelan people are, that his immediate security force is made up of Cubans.
So the men that surround Maduro, like our Secret Service, are Cubans, not Venezuelans.
That is my understanding and assessment of the situation.
So Venezuela's intelligence security services are so corrupt, so incompetent, so disloyal, so sclerotic that Maduro cannot even count on his own personal safety in his bed at night on his own people.
That's a fair assessment, as I understand, Senator.
How far does that go throughout the Venezuelan security and intelligence services? Does Nicolas Maduro have to depend on Cubans and Russians on the streets to beat his own people to keep them in line?
Senator, I'm not beyond the what I characterize. I'm not aware of the details, but we watch that closely. We've seen reporting of Russian security forces being flown in. We're looking for evidence of how that will play out. And certainly this is an area that has our focus as well as all our partners in the interagency.
And that was another point you mentioned, that you said you can't speak of Cuba's presence in Venezuela. Let me stop myself. Can you estimate in this setting how many Cuban security and intelligence officers there are in Venezuela?
Sir, I don't have that number. I'd take that for the record.
Is it fair to say there are lots?
I'd say there are many, sir. I'd also mention, Senator, the presence of China. China's not been helpful in diplomatic way. I'll leave that to the diplomats, but China's in there, and they're involved in cyber in ways that are absolutely not helpful to a democratic outcome.
You talk about Russians traveling into the country. Have we seen an increase in Russian presence in Venezuela in the last 2 months as the National Assembly began to take its seat and President Guaido declared himself as interim president, and the United States and so many other nations around the world have recognized his legitimacy?
Senator, it's hard with Russia to figure out what they're really up to.
You don't say.
There was reports last week by a Russian official TASS news agency that I was actually on the Colombian-Venezuela border, and they rolled that with B-roll footage of amphibious landings and helicopter assaults. I was actually walking out of Senator Rubio's office at the time, but I don't think the truth goes very, very far when it comes to their media, sir.
Okay, thank you for those comments, Admiral Fowler, about Venezuela. You mentioned China's activity in Venezuela in the cyber domain. They obviously are very active as well in what you might call debt diplomacy through their Belt and Road Initiative. Secretary of State Pompeo was in Panama last October cautioning that nation and all nations who are participants in China's Belt and Road Initiative about what it could mean for their sovereignty. Obviously, China has foreclosed in the port outside Colombo and Sri Lanka. Malaysia recently left the initiative because of China trying to throw its weight around. What's been the results of Secretary Pompeo's visit in the region, and what feedback are you getting from some of these Belt and Road Initiative members?
Senator, the states in the region, the countries, they want to continue to partner us. But I've cautioned the leaders that I've met with that while you might want to do that, if you leverage your ports and many of your businesses, including your IT infrastructure, to Chinese companies with no strings attached and limited understanding of what the internal workings are, that you've actually put yourself in jeopardy of having a meaningful security relationship with us. It gets to a point where I won't be allowed or authorized to share information because I just don't know where that information's going. So been very emphatic about that in terms of how it would affect us being a partner of choice. This is my concern to other questions that have been asked about what this hemisphere looks like 10, 15, 25 years from now and who the partner of choice is. We've got to be present, Senator.
Thank you, Admiral Fowler. General Waldhauser, one question for Africa. This is a little bit outside the warfighting domain, but the American military has called upon to do a lot outside that domain around the world, especially in your area of operations. Nigeria has its elections next weekend. Nigeria is the 7th largest country in the world, way larger than Russia or Mexico or Japan, important ally of ours. What are the prospects for that election? Does it appear that it will be free and fair and that either party, should they win, will continue to be a partner of the United States?
Senator, we're very much aware of the elections on February 16th. And from the military perspective, we watch that from the standpoint of actions leading up to and what will happen afterwards. On the intelligence reports, we hope it'll be a peaceful election. But I think our sights are set on forward and not in the rearview mirror, meaning that whoever would win, that now, okay, let's sit down and talk about where we are and how we can best help, whether it be the displaced people and the issues with humanitarian issues in northern Nigeria, whether it's their army and their work against Boko Haram and ISIS West Africa. So my answer to that question is, let's get the election over. And they're watching this today, by the way. I mean, my comments are going to be watched in Nigeria, and it's very important that I don't sway either way.
Sure, well.
But the bottom line is, whoever wins, we want to sit down with them, and now how do we move forward and improve the situation?
Good. Well, I appreciate that answer, and of course their election is a choice for the Nigerian people, and we want to have a good, stable relationship with whoever wins to help continue that partnership. Thank you, General.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. We've already discussed and gotten a good idea of how complex your missions are in both of your areas of operation. And, you know, our vital national interests are threatened by violent extremists, by great power competition, and all of the multifaceted challenges that you face. As I looked at recent reporting on SOUTHCOM, much attention has been on the dictator's effort to clinging to power, while in AFRICOM, the persistent presence of violent extremists. Are these events merely symptoms of a larger systemic problem in both regions? And what, in your assessments, are the prime drivers of instability in SOUTHCOM and AFRICOM? And how are your commands postured to deal with the root causes? Because it's one thing to deal with the symptoms, but what are we doing to really get to the root causes that are occurring in both of your regions?
I'll go first, Senator. Thank you very much. And I'll use Niger as an example. Niger has a population of about 19 million. About 50% of those are under the age of 15. They certainly are in a very difficult area of Africa, meaning that they have pressing from all sides, whether it be ISIS West Africa, JNIM in the west, whether it be AQ coming down through the Algeria-Nigerian border on the way to Mali. They have ISIS West Africa on their eastern flank, so they're in a tough situation. But I think this is what goes unnoticed sometimes is the whole government approach that is used in Niger. So, for example, USAID has about $150 million a year that they use for things like education, especially for young girls, for government and government infrastructure and so forth. Moreover, the Millennium Challenge Corporation has, they're on, I think, the second year of a 5-year compact down there, which has to do with agriculture, watering crops, and so forth. So if you look at the security assistance that we're providing, and you add to that USAID's effort and the Millennium Challenge Compact, that's, I think, a good example of a whole government approach of how we're trying to deal with a country that has some very significant security challenges.
Thank you. Admiral Fuller?
We do have some bright spots. I'd like to point out Brazil has been an exporter of security in our history, same with Colombia, and the trajectory of both our mill-to-mill relations with those countries is very positive. In the current Venezuela situation, we're sharing a lot of information. We're looking at this as a regional solution. Chile commanded in our largest exercise, the Rim of the Pacific. But around the region, corruption, weak governance, lack of jobs, these are things that are affected, and these are where the military is part of this whole government solution. I saw this in Honduras. I was in an outreach center run by USAID. It was right next to a partnered police station. We had a few Army Civil Affairs people there meeting with some young men and women that had been supplied jobs. And I asked the one individual, he had gone all the way to the U.S.-Mexico border and turned around and came all the way back, walked as part of the caravan, but he came back. I said, well, why'd you come back? He said, it was pretty scary for me. I felt that I should come home. I said, well, why did you go? He goes, the family next to us was starving, or we're starving, and the family next to them was starving, but across the street they had some food because Their father had made it to the United States and was sending remittance back. So at the heart of this is it's the want of a better life and an economy, and the want to have your kids go to school. And all citizens of all the world deserve that.
Thank you. So looking at this whole government approach, how easy has it been for you each to work with other executive branch agencies to provide a coordinated whole government approach? And is this happening, for example, it may be happening in Niger, but is it happening in other parts of Africa? And how are we consistent in applying this approach, and what can we do to really help you be part of this team so that we can get at the root causes?
Well, Senator, I would say that the AFRICOM staff has individuals from those agencies that work very closely with us on a daily basis. Moreover, as dollars become tight, our return on investment needs to be demonstrated. And as a consequence, we have to be better stewards of our efforts in terms of where we want to place our emphasis. We need to coordinate that and synchronize that with this agency, because really it gets, I think, to the larger issue of influence and the China influence as well. We need to demonstrate that we can compete with them. We may not be building soccer stadiums or government buildings, but at the same time, we're teaching them how to be better farmers. We're showing them what education can do for them. So the bottom line for us is we need to continue to work with our partners, which we have good relationships with, by the way. There's this development, diplomacy, and defense effort in the AFRICOM at State Department and with AFRICOM is very, very positive experience.
Admiral?
We have representatives from every interagency at my headquarters, and they sit in every meeting. But we're working this problem set hard, and we're working in conjunction with country teams in the embassy. A consistent level of resourcing is important, and recognizing this is a problem that will take years to solve, not months or days.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. Senator Ernst.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. And of course, to the men and women in your commands, we thank them for what they do for all of us. To the family members that are here, thank you so much for the support that you give to your loved ones. So thank you. Admiral Fowler, I'll start with you. We've talked about a lot of different groups that are engaged in SOUTHCOM, but what I'd like to do is dive in a little bit to Hezbollah. They do have a notable presence in South America, and as we saw last year, Argentina and Brazil, they both took action against Hezbollah assets in their respective countries. And we've heard from regional authorities that they're aware of Hezbollah's presence in the tri-border area of Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. So can you go a bit further into the threat that Hezbollah presents in SOUTHCOM, and what are our interests in making sure that they are not affecting us? What are those national security interests for us and our partners?
Hezbollah is present. We watch them closely. It points to the importance of partnerships and the intelligence sharing relationships that we are keen to develop and strengthen even further, because a lot of what's required to monitor them is human intelligence, and those nations know their terrain best. Hezbollah's connection to Iran can never be understated. Iran is the largest sponsor of state terrorism in the world. There is a nexus there that goes back, and we watch that working in partnership with the other combatant commands, Defense Intelligence Agency, very, very closely. We look for trends, indications, and warning. A terror threat anywhere around the world could be a threat of our homeland.
And I appreciate you highlighting how Iran is interconnected here. We talk about some of those near-peer threats with China and Russia in the SOUTHCOM AOR, but we also need to recognize that Iran is a player as well. So thank you for making that connection. Do we have sufficient information sharing authorities in place then? You've mentioned the need to communicate with friends and allies. Do we have the right authorities available?
Senator, we have to work that on a country-by-country basis, and it's a key thing that we look at when we do our country engagements. So the answer is we never have enough. We have countries where we want to sign additional agreements. We have to get assurances with them about what they'll share and who they'll share it with. Goes back to my concern about who owns the IT infrastructure in a given city or a given fusion center. And so we're constantly looking at this. I fly Sunday to Brazil for my meeting with their new military leadership. This will be one of our top areas of discussion. I would say that's a very healthy intel sharing relationship that's growing, and we've been able to really work with our partners, because sharing information intelligence builds trust, frankly. And that's building trust is what is going to ensure our long-term interests in this hemisphere are safeguarded.
That is very good. And we've also talked about the role that special operations plays in achieving your objectives in SOUTHCOM. Part of that ties back into Hezbollah and others. But what are some of the biggest challenges that you'll face with regard to resources or authorities when it comes to our special operations and how we employ them in SOUTHCOM?
We have very small numbers of special operations teams that are engaged with partners, building their security forces and building it very effectively. Those need to be habitual relationships that are keyed off of what the partner needs. It's also good for our training as well, as our partners train in jungles and tough kind of terrain. I would say our challenge is maintaining that. Our soft forces are under pressure worldwide, and as we look at what their deployment ratio is, the amount of time they're spent away from home to the time they spend at home, making certain that we get that balance right, making certain that we don't decimate the small presence that we have, which would break trust and really break the training and the stability of our partner nation security forces.
Thank you. Yes, their dwell time is very small. We need to work on that. Before I move on to the general, we have also talked about Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay, and right now we do have Iowa National Guard soldiers deployed there as a security force. And so what can we do to ensure that the troops that we have that are stationed or a rotational force at Gitmo, that they are being cared for, that they are safe? Not only do we want to make sure that those that are held there are kept in a safe environment, but also for our troops. What more can we be doing? Can you explain some of the challenges that we have at Guantanamo Bay right now?
I had the honor to visit with some of your Iowa Guard prisoner guards, detainee guards, just last weekend, Senator, and they're doing fabulous work. So thanks for the state for that. The facilities were built with about a 5-year lifespan, and that's been 15, 20 years ago. And so our responsibility is the safe, humane treatment of the detainees, but also the safety of that guard force. So we have facilities that we're beyond the ability to repair the roofs, where the alarm systems are questionable based on the water intrusion. And so we have, when the President's budget released, I expect it to include money that would be put for some long-term facility upgrades and development. We need that for the safety of the guard force and for the future of safe detainees.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And in the few seconds I have remaining, General, as well, Special Operations Forces in Africa, do we need to maintain our special operators in Africa and the work that they are doing?
Well, we certainly need to maintain them, and we certainly have to take a close look at how we employ and deploy them and what their schedules are, and we continually reevaluate that all the time. The bottom line is yes, but I would say what we really need in AFRICOM are some predictable general purpose forces that can do things with regular armies on a somewhat episodic but yet predictable basis.
Very good. Thank you, General. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. The Chair and Ranking indicated that a unifier in your two regions is that you're under-resourced. I think another unifier is in both your regions. You have a real cross-disciplinary, non-siloed focus of not just military assets, but the entire spectrum of what the U.S. can do, and I think that's something about SOUTHCOM and AFRICOM that I really appreciate. Admiral Fowler, let me start with you. The discussion about Venezuela is a really important one, and if the world wants to see a democracy versus dictatorship challenge, Venezuela is just like the perfect test case for circa 2019. What do democracies care for and what do dictatorships care for? The Venezuelan government of Maduro is supported by Russia, Cuba, and Iran, and they're enabling him to do all kinds of horrible things economically in violation of human rights, et cetera. The Guaido interim government, which has a constitutional claim that in the vacancy of a president, the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly becomes an interim president, is supported by the United States and the EU. You really can see what the difference between democracy and the aspirations of democratic governments and dictatorships and what they care about, writ very clearly in the Venezuelan circumstance now. But But here's a reality. We're dealing with regional institutions like the OAS, for example. In the OAS, every nation has one vote. The U.S. has a hard time getting the OAS to firmly come out against the Maduro government because many Caribbean nations still support the Maduro government. They have been bribed to do so with low-price oil. But it's very hard for us to do something like this on our own, and when a principal regional institution like the OAS isn't completely with us, it's hard to put the appropriate pressure on. And I guess the point that I want to make is hard to beat something with nothing. The Chinese and Russians have been investing so heavily in Venezuela, tens of billions of dollars over and over and over again. These Caribbean nations, they might feel culturally closer to the United States, but they're getting something from Venezuela that they need. And your point about we need to be on the field is really, really important. And as I talk to leaders in this region, they say we would so much more like to do work with you guys. We are culturally connected and we're all Americans, you know. But the other guys are there and present and investing, and even if we have suspicions, they're there with resources and you aren't. And so I think that's an important lesson. When I ask about the Northern Triangle, it's a resource question as well. The Alliance for Progress has been an initiative in the last few years to invest money in security and economic development assistance in the 3 nations in the Northern Triangle. Would it be your recommendation, so long as we can make those investments smart, would it be a recommendation that if we can improve the security and economic development arc in those 3 countries, that would help us deal with some of the challenges that SOUTHCOM has to deal with?
Senator, the week before last, I visited projects in all 3 countries that were a direct result of the investments that you just cited. Those projects were USAID, state INL, and small footprint of Department of Defense working side by side to bring security with local policing and jobs and host nation investment in a way that stabilized some of the worst neighborhoods and showed hope. We talked to citizens that lived there. We saw the results, and I think consistent investment in accordance with our laws is a good thing in that area. Investment, a dollar there is going to save lives and result in better security here at home.
That's really important. The funds for those initiatives have been pretty dramatically slashed the last 2 years. We don't know what the budget submission will be that we'll get hopefully by the end of the month, but I think it's penny wise and pound foolish to cut development and security assistance and then complain about people coming to our border. We need to help build and support economies there and security there if we want people to not leave their own countries. Let me quickly, General Waldhauser, to you. On page 5 of your submitted statement, you write, in the fight against Boko Haram and ISIS West Africa, we operate with partners in the Africa Union Enforced Multinational Task Force. The fiscal year 18 NDAA included a provision in section 1264 that required the administration to provide an initial report and subsequent updates on the legal and policy frameworks for use of military force. I'm interested, the initial report, which was submitted in March of 2018, I'd like to put that in the record if I could. It makes no mention of ISIS West Africa or Boko Haram as an associated force. And as far as I know, there's not been an updated report submitted to this committee, as would be required if any new determination were made. Has Boko Haram or ISIS West Africa been determined to be an associated force within either the 2001 or 2002 AUMF?
Senator, first of all, we do not have offensive strike capabilities or authorities in those countries. So we can't strike. We can strike in Somalia, we can strike in Libya, but not in Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, and the like, so we don't have authorities there. Now, ISIS West Africa has grown. They go by different names every once in a while, but they have grown in numbers. They're now probably in the neighborhood of around 3,000 to 4,000. That's the best estimate that we have. They have been very aggressive over the summer into this year. They now have taken large pieces of real estate in northern Nigeria, and I think of the 2 right now, they're the one that we have the most concern about because we're not sure what their intentions would be with regards to outside the region. Boko Haram, probably around 1,000. Bottom line, though, Senator, I can't say for sure whether they've been designated or not. I know that we don't strike them.
When you say you don't strike, do you also include you don't strike under a collective self-defense doctrine?
No. If we are accompanying, that's the whole key here now. If we are accompanying, we have the inherent right of self-defense and collective self-defense. If we are not accompanying, which we have not done at all in Nigeria, and we haven't accompanied inside other places for quite some time, we do not have a collective self-defense because I haven't designated it. and we don't use it.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Hawley.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here, and thank you again for your exemplary service and for all those under your command. General, let me start with you. The National Defense Strategy, of course, reemphasizes great power competition, and we've talked a lot about today, and you mentioned to a great degree in your testimony. I want to ask you about China in particular and your AOR. What can you tell us, to what degree and in what ways are we continuing to shift focus and resources to engage in this great power competition and counter Chinese influence in your AOR? And I'm thinking in particular of China's growing influence. It's based in Djibouti. I've seen estimates that there may be as many as 25, 27 Chinese bases across the continent. What can you tell us about that and what we're doing to counter this growing influence there?
Well, thank you, Senator. Let me try to take that from the 50,000-foot level. And first of all, just to emphasize, China has one overseas base in Djibouti. They participate in UN peacekeeping operations, places like Mali, places like Sudan, but they do not have other bases. Is that in their future? That's perhaps. What I would say is, from the African perspective, is China has been there for quite some time. They're in the process of building over 3,800 miles worth of railroads tied primarily to areas of mineral extraction, which can then take this goods to a port somewhere. So they're heavily invested, heavily involved. From the African perspective, the Africans, do not want to be in the middle of this. They don't view it as we either choose the U.S. or we choose China, and they don't want to be in the middle of that particular engagement. I think that one of the things that we do from the DoD perspective is we try to just be good partners. And when Secretary Tillerson was there a year or so ago, or whenever the visit took place, I believe it was a year or so ago, he talked about we need to work with the governments of those countries to make sure the arrangements they make are in their best interests. And you had leaders from the African Union. You've had Paul Kagame is another one that, the African governments will make their decisions based on their best interests, and they're capable of doing that. On the other hand, the Chinese efforts in terms of selling of equipment and some of the arrangements that have been made, there's been some blowback from various countries. Sierra Leone, for example, is walking away from an airport agreement that was supposed to be built by the Chinese. The Kenyans, for example, have have problems with the Chinese equipment that's been sent to them. So again, the bottom line is, in the AFRICOM AOR, China is there. The final thing I would say, in order to this issue of influence and how we want to be the best partners, the Chinese work hard at developing and maintaining the relationship with the senior officials of the governments inside the African continent. We are very grateful, for example, of Senator Inhofe and his team and his visits that they make there. But I read an article the other day that talked about, in the last decade, 80 senior level, we're talking minister and above, to include the president of China, visits on the African continent. That's a lot. And moreover, since 1990, their foreign minister, his first trip is every year in January is to a country in Africa, just to see how they're doing. So I would just say the whole government approach, if we want to maintain influence, we have to kind of up our engagement and develop and work at the relationship part of this.
You testified, I think, last March to a House Committee, March of 2018, that you expected that we should expect an increasing number of bases, outright military bases. Do you think, is that still your assessment?
Well, I think first of all, the Belt and Road Initiative is what is driving all of this. And I think what the Chinese are doing is they're taking a lot of lessons learned, and they are learning a lot from their first overseas base that they have in Djibouti. This is not an easy thing to do. The United States is very good at it. They watch what we do, but they're learning this. They certainly have their eyes on other facilities. Ports, for example, are a key to what would facilitate their not only mineral extraction, but their markets for their goods to come into the continent as well. I mean, they view this large youth bulge, the population demographics, which we haven't talked about today, but it's in the testimony. They view a large consumer class as a place where they can sell their goods sometime in the future. So although they don't have, Djibouti is the only base, they certainly are looking at other options.
Let me just ask you more generally about our European allies and their help or lack thereof in your AOR. What things should we be doing in order to encourage our European allies to, in this era of renewed great power competition, to be helping us with our strategic objectives in the area under your command?
From the AFRICOM perspective, the European Union does a lot on the continent with regards to training. So they have there are European Union training missions in Mali. There are European training missions inside Somalia, and those are just two examples. And we work closely with them because we are one, for example, I'm indicated in Somalia, we are one of a group of organizations and countries that is trying to, make things right there. The European Union is a big player, and we coordinate with them. I talk with their leadership all the time, and our effort to coordinate the training activities in a place like Somalia, the European Union is a big player. They do a lot, and they, by the way, are the ones who pay the stipends for the Somali National Army. They've put a lot of money into Somalia, no doubt about it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator Blumenthal and Senator Reed presiding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for your service and for being here today in critical commands that are perhaps less in the spotlight, but no less important than any of the others that we oversee, both of them absolutely critical to our national security. And so thank you and the men and women who serve with you for your service to our nation. I want to begin on the topic of military partnership programs, also perhaps less visible to the public, but very important. And both of you, I think, have endorsed the state partnership programs. The International Military Education and Training Program, as General Otel testified on Tuesday, are, he said, dollar for dollar, the most effective funding that CENTCOM receives from a strategic perspective. And the Connecticut National Guard, as a matter of fact, is an active participant in the state partnership program and currently partners with Uruguay. Next year is the 20th anniversary of this partnership, and to date, the Connecticut National Guard has conducted over 110 mutually beneficial exchanges with their Uruguayan partners. In April, the Connecticut National Guard will send 40 soldiers and airmen on a Connecticut Air National Guard C-130H to Uruguay, marking our largest contingent to Uruguay to date. This is an enormously educational, beneficial experience for them, for the Uruguayans, and it is repeated again and again and again all around the world. And this kind of relationship, I think, is extremely important to both countries, to us and other countries around the world. So thank you for your support. And General Ivan, our TAG, was here this morning, and we had a chance to meet with him. I want to ask you, General Waldhauser, I was searching for the exact statement you made about a year before the Niger tragedy, if I may put it that way, about the lack of sufficient intelligence resources devoted to your command, particularly to that area of your command. And I note in your testimony, you say over a 3-year period, U.S. Africa Command has increased Nigerian counter-IED capability, as well as intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, sustainment, maintenance, and operation. Your estimate as to the dearth and deficit of intelligence in that part of the world was striking to me before the Niger incident. How much improvement has there been in the investment in intelligence in that part of the world?
Senator, I think the best way to answer that question is, our mission there really is to work with our partners, and in this case, it's the French. And I would say over the last year that our relationship with the French, to include intelligence sharing, has really gone to as good as I've seen it. And so, the French have the lead in that area. We support partners, and in that particular case, in the Sahel area of northern Mali, Niger area, they have the lead, and it's our job to support them. So we kind of use the phrase, it's African-led, French-assisted, and U.S.-supported. And what I would say is that our intelligence professionals, as they synchronize what we bring and what they bring, is something that has really added to our ability to understand the situation there over the last year.
Do you think now that it is satisfactory, adequate, excellent? How would you characterize it? You said as good as you've seen, but that was not very good in the year before the Niger incident.
So I would use the words, as you said, satisfactory and adequate. We're never going to have the ISR total that we need to include the human intelligence that goes into places like that. But for our support, for what our mission is, it's adequate ISR now as we utilize our partners and how we train and how we assist the Nigerian forces as well.
Would you say, Admiral Fowler, that that's true in your command as well, that you're satisfied that there are sufficient ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance resources devoted?
Senator, we're constantly looking at this. I think we do have gaps. We mitigate those gaps with different sources of intelligence. We are deficient in our ISR for the counter-narcotics mission.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On behalf of Chairman Inhofe, Senator Blackburn, please.
Thank you for being here today, and we look forward to a closed session with you. I want to come back to something each of you have mentioned, but we've really not talked that much about, and that is the telecom issues that are in each of your AOR and the participation of China, Huawei, ZTE, and their relationship with the Russians. And the chairman mentioned earlier his concern about how China is putting their fingers into every area when it comes to not only the ISR, but the communications component, building out these networks. And he mentioned he didn't know where the money came from. And General, I'd be interested to hear from you, when you talk about China and how they are advancing, how much of the bankrolling of this comes from Russia, or do you all know?
Well, ma'am, the best way to answer that is I think that when the Chinese come to a country with a plan, whether it's to build railroad, infrastructure, bridges, and the like, they come with a full plan. They come with the charts to do it. They come with the money to do it. They'll bring the workers to do it. And it's just kind of a one-stop,
Does the money come from Russia primarily?
This is Chinese now. In fact, how I would answer that is in kind of not to be in a kind of an anecdotal way, but recently in the elections in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where Joseph Kabila just went out of office, one of his opponents said that the Chinese bring the money and the Russians bring the muscle. So I think that's a good way to try to illustrate kind of where these two different countries are when it comes to their engagement.
Okay. Let me ask you this. When we look at what has happened with the Chinese and with their access into the telecom area, and as we look at artificial intelligence and 5G, how do you see Huawei and their participation, and how is that going to affect the build-out in your AORs? And Admiral, if you want to go at it first, and then the General.
It's concerning, the extent to which China would own the IT infrastructure of a country, their intelligence or fusion centers, would affect our relationship and our ability to...
Do they understand that you will not share information with them if it is going over Huawei or ZTE?
We've had frank discussions,
very
Senator,
frank
about
discussions. Okay.
Senator, the way I would answer that is we obviously have some unique challenges in Djibouti. I mean, the Chinese base is several miles away from where we're located. The Djibouti base services not only AFRICOM, but it does CENTCOM and SOUTHCOM, I believe, as General Votel testified the other day. We'd be naive to think that the counterintelligence and the communication issues and the fact that they have actually built the system inside Djibouti, they're not trying to get after what we're trying to do.
Okay. How do you make certain, what is your best effort in making certain that we remain the partner of choice?
Well, again, as I said several times this morning, from our military perspective, we want to be sincere in our efforts. We want to deliver what we say we can do. We want to be role models when our troops train with African troops. We want our equipment to be quality equipment, and we just essentially want to be good partners. And I think that when you bring in the agencies that we talked about, USAID, Millennium Challenge Corporation, and so forth, their projects, I mean, we've got to make sure we elevate those, because in places like Senegal, for example, the Chinese will build a wrestling stadium, but at the same time, we have all kind of compacts ongoing that don't get the publicity that some of these things do. So it's bottom line for us is we have to make sure that we're really doing a government, overall whole of government approach, and we're synchronizing our efforts, and we make sure that we take credit for some of these programs that may not get the visibility that a brand new infrastructure would.
Thank you for the comments, and we hope that that whole of government approach continues to include making certain that we're paying attention to those telecom and wireless networks. Yield back.
Thank you, Senator. Let me just announce, it looks like we're down to the most important, of course, last, we say for. We are going to have, I would say to the staff of those who are not here right now, we're going to have a closed session immediately following this in Visitor Center 217 for those who would like to come and ask some of the questions that were not appropriate to be asked in an open session. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Feller, you're not going to be surprised by this question. The question is interdiction of drug shipments, and I understand it's already been discussed to some extent. What do you need? If you were given a blank sheet of paper, what does the Coast Guard need? What do you need? What do we need to do a better job of interdicting those drug shipments that we know about? It's so frustrating that we are only interdicting about 25% of what we know about. So do we need 18 more cutters, 12 more, more Zodiacs? What's on your list of assets?
It's all of our responsibility, and we've got to start the source. So very encouraged by the Colombian government getting seriously back into the eradication game, and they've met their goals for 18, and we're seeing progress in 19. So record cocaine is going to mean record drug flows. Then we've got to stop it along the way. That requires ISR, intelligence and surveillance assets, Maritime Patrol aircraft, helicopters.
No, I understand that, but I'm asking you for some specifics. Do we need 8 more Global Hawks? Do we need 14 more cutters? What is it we need?
We need more Navy ships.
Okay.
From our U.S.
Of
Navy.
what nature?
The littoral combat ship is fit for purpose for this type of mission center. We need multiple force packages. We need the Coast Guard sustained presence. They've stepped up in a big way from 5 to 8 cutters over the holiday. And then we need the partners in the game. We're seeing improvements in some of the partners. I'll credit El Salvador, Guatemala. We need others to step up, and that requires pressure from our government and myself to get that to happen. So a lot of work to be done, Senator.
But do you feel we are moving the needle? Are we moving forward on these multiple fronts?
We had record interdiction in 17, 18, but it's insufficient. We're nudging, but we're not moving the needle enough, Senator. And one of the areas you asked me to look at previously, I need to get back to you on, is the authority piece and whether we have artificial seams between the air-land boundary and how we can better utilize and work across that boundary. We've stepped up our partnership within the last year with Drug Enforcement Agency and fusion centers here in the United States. Again, more needs to be done to stay ahead of the threat.
I just hope if there are assets in terms of either budgetary resources, authorities, you will let us know, because these drugs are killing our people, and one a day in Maine, and this is it seems to me a high return opportunity here, given the fact that we know of the shipments that we can't interdict.
Senator, I agree 100%. It's a threat to our nation, killing our citizens. It's killing citizens of our partner nations as well. And the money from this is fueling those drug and criminal organizations, which is driving instability. It's contributing to the other factors we see, like the illegal migration. So it's important for many reasons that we have to get after this.
Stay with us on this, Admiral. Thank you. On the issue of, and you mentioned in your testimony, I think in answer to Senator Kane, about progress you're seeing in the Northern Triangle countries based upon American investments. I would point out that there was a huge refugee problem in the world in 1945. There were about 10 million refugees in Western Europe after World War II. One of the responses of this country was the Marshall Plan, which was designed to stabilize the economies of that region. It was very controversial at the time, but I think all would agree now it was immensely successful. I think we need a similar kind of approach to stabilizing those countries so people don't have to flee. The best way to stop someone coming to our border is that they never start on the journey. And that means, I believe you agree, that means work, AID, agriculture, all of those programs in those countries, again, dealing with the issue of corruption, but to try to do that effectively. Do you agree that should be a priority?
Senator, I agree. That should be a priority.
Thank you. Quick question, General. By the way, these graphics are terrific on Chinese and Russian influence in Latin America. I compliment your staff, whoever presented them. They're very dramatic and sobering. General, in Africa, China's doing similar kinds of things, investing, lending, developing infrastructure, all those things. Is there a concern that this is a precursor to a military presence? I mean, is Djibouti a beginning of a militarization process that presents a kind of global threat or an expansion of a threat from China?
Senator, I think at this point in time, it's too early to make that leap at this point. I mean, they obviously want it. One of the reasons for their engagement there is they've got, 2,000 or so peacekeepers. They've got 300,000 or so civilians there. They want to be able to protect their interests in their projects that they're working on. So whether that leads to a militarization of the continent, it's still early to tell. But I would say that one of the areas of concern that we have there is in the Djibouti, the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb area, where the Red Sea comes down, where we've had really open access for quite some time. That is an area of concern because not only the Chinese, but the Russians, the Emiratis, the Saudis are all interested in real estate on the Red Sea on the African side, Sudan, Eritrea.
And they're using an interesting technique of lending money and then calling it. It's a kind of debt colonialism.
Well, they have leverage in many of their situations. And as I said, I mean, these are decisions these governments have to make. But Djibouti is really a classic example where the Chinese own over 80% of their overseas debt. And this is certainly a concern.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Senator King. Before Senator Perdue is recognized, I want to repeat to the staff that's here that there will be a closed session after this. Hate to ask you to go over because there may be nobody there when you get there, but nonetheless, there will be this opportunity. All right, Senator Perdue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for your careers and for being here today. I want to beat a dead horse because I don't think we've gotten to the essence of the issue yet. We're all concerned about what China and Russia are doing in your AORs. General Votel was in this week. We had the same conversation about China's Belt Road Initiative in harbors like Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Gwadar in Pakistan. We've just seen the first foreclosure in Sri Lanka, obviously, but what Russia's also doing in Kaliningrad and Sevastopol and Latakia and Tortoise. Americans have always projected power based on our Navy and based on our allies who allow us to service our military through their geography. Russia and China are both now, because we have such an advantage in the sea, it seems to me that they are setting the stage across 3 continents that are of tremendous strategic importance. I'd like us to talk about what the NDS does or doesn't do and what you both need in your AORs to deal with what we naturally have to assume is an effort that is an economic, if not military, involvement that is beyond anybody's expectation 5 years ago. And when I look at what Huawei is doing in some of these Latin American cities, I'm very concerned. So I'd love both of you to address the question specifically. Before I ask you both, General, first of all, in Africa, we know now, Admiral, you've just told us there are 56 port investments in South America. In Africa, General, do we have a similar estimate of the ports that they've made these, what I call debt trap diplomacy loans in the specific port infrastructure?
Senator, I'm not an expert in that area, and we can take that for the record, but what I will say, that Chinese are involved in port operations all around the world.
Yep.
So it's not unique that perhaps you have a Chinese company that has equities in a port on the African continent.
Right. So what we saw in the South China Sea, though, is where they had, quote, non-military interest, we've got plenty of evidence that they've converted those to military bases. I have no doubt that they're going to have some of the same interest in particularly Hambatoto right there. It's such a strategic thing, a location. The question I have is, I don't think the NDS actually addresses this growing potential threat because we haven't been able to confirm it, as you just said, General. So my concern is in these two AORs, you and General Votel are three guys that sit right in the middle of what China and Russia are both doing. And I'm worried because of the effort and the focus we have on the current crisis today around the world, where we're taking our assets and spreading them very, very thinly. What are we doing now to preclude the potential that we won't be able to show up? It'll be too late once we recognize that they've actually done what we were worried they were going to do. Would you both address that as it relates to the NDS?
Well, Senator, let me just kind of clarify. You know, I don't have a crystal ball to predict what the Chinese will do militarily on the African continent. But what I do know is that they've made a conscious decision to put their military on the world stage in an area where the United States is not necessarily engaged to a large degree.
Yes, sir.
So they work in areas where they don't really have any competition from us. We're not in countries where they are. We're not at places where ports on the western side of Africa, which is my big concern, by the way, on the western side of Africa, we're not really located there. So there's no doubt about the fact that they have a long-term vision, and by 2049, the 100-year anniversary, part of this Belt Road Initiative, Djibouti's not the first, and it won't be the last port. And the growth of their military on the continent, I don't know what it'll turn out to be, but I do know that the Chinese, they've made a conscious decision to start there, and they're not going to get smaller.
Other than Djibouti, do we have any other access ports in Africa?
Well, I think I would say Capo Verde, Senegal. These are places that we've talked about before that are, you know, they're good locations for the Chinese. They want to have a government that's relatively stable. They don't want to have to deal with problems and so forth. You look where the military geography, meaning deep water ports, are there. So I mean, they certainly want other ports on the eastern, and there's all kind of speculation about what those other ports might be on the eastern side. But I do know they're looking on the western side, and that's a concern for us because they can be in the Atlantic Ocean rather quickly.
Admiral, the ambassador in El Salvador actually warned last August about what the Chinese military is planning to do in La Union, that commercial port where they do have a proprietary loan there. Can you speak to how the NDS will affect this in your AOR?
Senator, I think the NDS rightly shined a light on this as a biggest challenge that will confront us perhaps in next generation.
But we haven't resourced it yet.
We're working on the resourcing. It's not, as I've mentioned in previous questions, we need that consistent level of resourcing in this AOR. In addition to the ports you mentioned, I was also point out the space stations that the Chinese are investing in and partnering in this AOR. And again, back to the education, some of the basic military building blocks, that they're taking a page from our playbook. The Peace Ark deployed to South America and the Caribbean this past year, they're trying to replicate our playbook to win both access and influence. And our counter has to be to remain present. We have the ability to have the winning hand based on our values, our democratic principles, and the shared interests that we have in this hemisphere.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Senator Good. Okay, that's it. All right, it seems this has come to a conclusion. We appreciate your attention very much. It has been very significant, and I also appreciate the time both of you have spent with me and other members of this committee. If it's not inconvenience to do so, we will now go to the Senate visitors number 217, and we'll see how many people want to conclude this with some questions that may not have been appropriate for the open session. So with that, we are adjourned.
Thank you. I will not join you. Forgive me.
And I will not join me.
So we both.
push one. Push the thing.